Hey there, welcome to this week's episode of Next Level Play Therapy, where we talk about everything and anything related to play therapy to help you take your play therapy skills to the next level. So, this week, I want to talk about something that I find comes up over and over and over when I am working with people in my Play Therapy Academy, which is my online play therapy consultation program. Also, when I do live webinars, or in the past, when I did in person trainings, which I'll be doing again, hopefully in 2024, that'll happen again. And I talk about these a lot in my online courses as well, because I find that when we're thinking about case conceptualization and using that information for treatment planning, one of the things that comes up over and over is how how am I going to set up play therapy for success? What do I need to do in order to feel less frustrated, overwhelmed, and worried that I'm doing a terrible job? This usually comes up when we are working with parents. This question comes up a lot when I start talking with people about what's going on with their case, and we go through a little bit of the case conceptualization to really understand what's at the root of the problems. That's the purpose of that case conceptualization. And then we use that for our treatment planning. Treatment planning is really about, okay, now that I know what's at the root of the problem, then what needs to happen? Those are going to be influenced by your play therapy model. And depending on your model, will dictate how you're going to address that. For example, child centered play therapy, you're not going to come up with interventions. You're going to use the information to kind of help guide you through the treatment process. You can use it in sessions in terms of what am I tracking? How am I tracking with that? Where it usually comes up with a model like play therapy, because child centered play therapy is really more about how you're going to be working with parents, because with child centered play therapy, you're going to be working with parents. That's in a separate session. You may also find this true for more process oriented play therapy models, where it's more about engaging in that therapeutic relationship, and you're kind of more uh, free flowing, so to speak, more process oriented, kind of seeing how things go. Case conceptualization still matters for those. I disagree with the belief that we don't need good case conceptualization at the beginning. And if you've been listening to any of my weekly episodes, then you will know, you will probably have heard me say that. And I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, because if you're working with parents, if you're working with children, then how are you conceptualizing the role of parents or caregivers? That's part of you're figuring that out with your case conceptualization in terms of what's going on in the system that might be maintaining, or what patterns are going on that are sustaining this. That's an important thing to look at. Lately, I've been looking at some research because I'm developing a new course, which will probably be out in May, early May, about working with parents. So that one's on the horizon. And when I do that, I go through and I look at different research. I see what the research says, because I really think it's important that we figure out what model we're going to use, what play therapy model we're going to use. And then I also think it's important to check out what the research is saying. And then you wrap all of that up with really strong therapeutic rapport with parents and with the child, then I think to me that's what sets things up for success. The other thing that I want to talk about has to do with that case conceptualization and your treatment planning and using that information to figure out what do you need to do, why do you need to do it, and how you're going to do it. When you do that, foundational to that process is also figuring out what are your expectations. And that's what I want to talk about today. How do you identify and what are your expectations and why does that matter? This is especially true when you're just getting started. Like I remember when I just got like 30 years ago, I had no idea. I didn't know. And part of the process is figuring that out. And a lot of the things that I've learned over the last 30 years working in mental health with children and families is really important to figure out what your expectations are. This is where I remember I ran into a lot of problems, a lot of frustration, a lot of um, worry and confusion about what's going on and how do I help my clients. And that's what we are going to talk about today. So, if you are joining me live today on this week's live stream, I would love to know who is here live today. So if you will post your name in the comments, I would love to see who's here. Post your name in the comments, where you're from, what population you work with. Do you have a play therapy theoretical model that you are using, or one that you're if you're new to play therapy, is there one that you're kind of leaning towards and exploring? And let's get started. So the first thing to think about is, what are your expectations and why does it matter to figure those out? One of the things that I find when I'm working with people, especially when I'm doing consulting, which is one of the reasons I address this a lot in the courses that I create and the trainings that I do, which is identify your expectations. The likelihood you are not really identifying those and communicating those is pretty high if you find yourself getting frustrated and anxious that it's not working, and you find that maybe clients aren't showing up for sessions the way they're supposed to be showing up, or maybe you're trying to engage parents and it's not working very well, or your client's not making very much progress. I find this one happens a lot when you're working with children who are from divorced families and maybe visitation is on the weekend. And then what decisions are you making around frequency of sessions and who's involved? And how have you communicated those? The thing that I like to say, it's kind of like, for those of you who have been in a relationship, or maybe you're married, it's kind of like, my husband and I have been married together actually for like over 34 years. We've been married over 30, I think 32. Yeah, coming up on 32. When you're first married, I think everything's fine. And then you begin to kind of get irritated with little things like, what are they doing? And you're working through things and you find yourself getting a little irritated about things your partner was doing, or maybe your partner wasn't doing. And the longer you let things go unsaid and unaddressed, if they're important, then there begins to be this kind of underlying frustration or maybe some resentment building. And you may start getting irritated or angry or maybe even hurt that things aren't going the way, like your partner should just know these things. Like they should just know it's important to you. This might be more females than males, and I think it still happens both ways. The reason for this is usually because you haven't really had a conversation about expectations, probably because you didn't even know you had the expectations in the beginning until you started getting irritated. And communicating those, first and foremost, you have to identify what they are. And then how are you going to communicate those? Um, hey, Steph. Steph says, made it today. Yay, Steph. Welcome. Steph's in my Play Therapy Academy program. And I don't know, you've probably heard me say this 1,000 times, Steph, like communicating expectations to parents. For the relationship to be successful, and it's important, like we know we have a therapeutic relationship. We know it's a relationship, right? Where it's that therapeutic use of self. We, in a professional way with professional boundaries, engage in a relationship with clients. We bring ourself into that therapy relationship. And this includes our therapy relationship with parents. When we're working with kids, we're working with the parents or the caregivers. And our relationship building with them is just as important as it is with the kids. So clearly identifying what our expectations are, especially for parents, is really important. So part of that's going to include like how often you're going to meet, how it works when you're providing play therapy sessions. Even if you've been providing play therapy for a while and you've kind of recognized your expectations, it's still really important to communicate those, because parents bring their kids to us. They may not necessarily know how therapy works. They may not know why it's important to meet with their child on a weekly basis. They may not know why it's important to bring their child consistently. They may not know why their involvement is so important. You're the expert. They're bringing their child to you. Whether or not you feel like the expert, you are the expert. So they are bringing their child to you. So they may not know why they need to be involved because you're involved. They're bringing their child to you. A big reason we identify our expectations is we want to communicate those. We want to help parents understand what play therapy with us looks like. Maybe they went to a different therapist or a play therapist prior to you. They may not know that previous therapist may have done things very differently. That previous therapist may or may not have been a play therapist. Lots of therapists who say they work with children don't use play therapy. They may use games and toys, and they're not using play therapy if they haven't really been trained how to do it. So recognizing that and communicating expectations is really important. So here are some questions first and foremost that it's probably a good idea for you to ask yourself first to figure out what your expectations are. So how often are you going to meet with children and adolescents, and why is that important? I tell parents, I meet with your child weekly. I tell them I use 45-minute sessions because I like having time in between. Why is that important? So I explain why consistency is important, why weekly sessions are important versus every other week. I also think it's important to figure out, how are you going to work with parents and why? And to me, this comes ties back in a lot to your case conceptualization, which this now we're asking those treatment planning questions, which is who's going to be involved and why. So how are you going to be working with parents? What modalities of treatment are you going to be using? And why are you using those modalities, like parent coaching or parent-child sessions, or maybe family play therapy sessions? Um, so the other thing is you want to recognize that structure is important, and you don't want to be too rigid. So when I say structure, that has a lot to do with frequency, how long the sessions are, who's in the sessions, what type of modality are you using, why do you need the parents to bring their clients on a weekly basis versus every other week? What happens if they don't bring them on a weekly basis? And when might you need to be a little bit more flexible with that, and why? But also, what are the potential consequences of, even though we may need to be flexible in some ways, we also have to recognize that if we're veering away from what we know is really important and going to get them the best results in the quickest amount of time, then we need to understand if we veer away from that, then there may be some consequences for that, for lack of a better way of saying it. The other thing you want to think about is how are you going to communicate parents? This is a big one that I talk about a lot with people. How do you want to communicate with parents? How do you want them to communicate with you, and why? What are your ways of communicating? And this is, I know a lot of the tendency is to text and email and have a lot of conversations that are therapeutic through text and emails. And while I recognize the how will I say, while I recognize the how that makes things easier and why it's more convenient, I also don't think it's a good idea. So, and here's where I usually say, well, you got to keep in mind ethics around texting and emails. The other thing is the practical part of time management. So this is where your structure comes in. If you've clearly communicated, you've recognized what your structure is going to be. When are you meeting with parents? How often are you meeting with parents? Do you want both parents? Is it okay to only have one parent? Or how are you going to manage it meeting with parents when parents are not together anymore and they're very high conflict? How are you going to manage that communication? Who's going to be talking to who? So maybe you decide, because it's high conflict, that you're going to use email communication. Recognize and have conversations with parents around the potential privacy issues of that. But you also need to recognize that that information can be used in ways that you may not want it to be used, because it's not going to be helpful for the client's treatment. So that's where you have your structure, but sometimes you need to be flexible. You have to think about what might be the potential harm or potential for harm for that. Hey there, Mary Carla. So Mary Carla from Washington, D.C. I want to work with children with disabilities, especially neurodivergent and visually impaired or blind, or a combination of these. I'm just studying my RPT credential. Welcome, Mary Carla. I think Mary Carla is also in my Facebook group, so welcome. That's awesome. And I am actually from the Washington, D.C. area. I lived in Northern Virginia. I moved here to the West Coast in Southern Nevada about 7.5 years ago now. So it's always nice to connect with people back from the East in my old haunts. So welcome, Mary Carla. So those are some questions you want to think about when you are trying to figure out your expectations. And in the beginning, you may try to figure out some of your expectations, and then based on your experience and how you've kind of figured out how you are as a play therapist, what works for you, then you may kind of revise that as you go along. Here's an important thing to think about when you are figuring out your expectations, when you're identifying your expectations and how you're communicating those, especially when this comes to parents. Recognize when your imposter syndrome has kicked in. So, I've done some previous episodes on imposter syndrome. If you want to take a deeper dive into that, how do you know when you have imposter syndrome? It's really important to identify when your imposter syndrome kicks in, because it has the capacity to really derail your effectiveness working with your clients, especially with parents. This is usually where it comes up. So it's going to create havoc with establishing clear boundaries, maintaining those clear boundaries, and communicating those boundaries. So there's a way to communicate your expectations and maintain that therapeutic relationship. That's an important part of it. And it's important to figure out what those are. What I find happens a lot is when the imposter syndrome kicks in, then you begin to doubt your skills and your ability with clients. And then that usually results in trying all different kinds of interventions as a way to kind of prove yourself and make sure that your clients and their parents actually think you're being helpful. You want to feel like you're feeling helpful. That's why you get into play therapy. It's why I got into the mental health field, to make a difference for children, adolescents, and families. So your imposter syndrome, when that kicks in, is going to make you feel like you don't know what you're doing. You're going to be insecure, and that's going to interfere with your ability to kind of communicate when you need to about expectations, and sometimes even like hold those therapeutic boundaries to help clients get the change that they need to accomplish. When your syndrome kicks in, usually what happens is you don't communicate. You use the spaghetti against the wall strategy of trying all different kinds of play therapy activities without really any intention or plan behind the process. And you may find yourself not communicating with parents. You may find yourself getting frustrated, but you don't want to say anything to them because you're worried they will get mad and pull their client from treatment because you're doing a terrible job. And if they pull their child, then that means you've done a terrible job. So you can see where it begins to kind of snowball when you don't recognize when your imposter syndrome has kicked in. And then you can take the necessary steps that you need to figure out how to tell your inner critic in your brain, or the critic committee inside of your brain, to stop talking and to shut up, basically, so that you can show up in a way that you know you can and get the change that you know you can get. So here are some things. One, you're identifying what your expectations are. Two, identifying when imposter syndrome has kicked in. And here's some things to think about when you're communicating with parents. I always recommend when parents, if you're taking those phone calls, then make sure you communicate with parents on the very first phone call. If you are not the one taking that initial phone call, then I would make sure to have a conversation with those people taking those initial phone calls what they need to say to parents about what the expectations are. If I would also recommend having that conversation at that very first diagnostic intake session where you're doing your full, hopefully, psychosocial assessment, gathering all the information that's going to be the foundation for your case conceptualization, knowing so you can use that session as you're building rapport, gathering the information. You're also communicating expectations. I would highly recommend that you explain what play therapy model you're using, how that works, and how it's going to benefit their child, how that addresses the concerns that they have. That way, you're beginning some of that education around what play therapy is and why you're using the play therapy model that you're using and how it works for their child. You also want to communicate to parents, what are your expectations for their involvement in the treatment process and why is that important? This is the one that I find doesn't happen very often. And I think it's an important one to figure that out. What is your expectation for their involvement? And then you need to communicate that to them. How is their involvement going to be helping their child accomplish what they want their child to accomplish? But, the reason they're bringing their child in. You also need to communicate to parents who needs to be involved in the treatment process. Do you want both parents, or is it okay for just one parent to get involved? Do you want siblings involved? This is part of your case conceptualization. Some of this, part of some of this we don't always know in the beginning. I know because I've been doing it long enough, the likelihood that I'm going to be doing some parent-child sessions is very high. And the likelihood that I'm doing some family play therapy sessions is very high. So I'll say that in the beginning. I'll explain how the first 90 days look. Then I'll explain I'll explain how often parents are coming in. I'll explain why. I'll explain what parents. We'll have a conversation when there is a divorced family. Children come from a divorced or separated, maybe parents have never been together. So we'll have that conversation around who's going to be involved. How is that going to work? What are the expectations around privacy and communication? And you're going to have a conversation around how they can communicate with you, how you'll communicate with them. What are the expectations about email or text or getting phone calls in between sessions? Also, you want to be clear about what your boundaries are during play therapy sessions, because we do set limits during play therapy sessions. A lot of this is going to be influenced by your play therapy model. And one of the things that I loved, so my foundational training is child-centered play therapy, and I took child-centered play therapy from the National Institute for Relationship Enhancement, NIRE, right outside Washington, D.C. in Bethesda, Maryland, with Bill Nordling. And one of my favorite things that Bill Nordling said during that training that has stuck in my brain like glue, because child-centered play therapy is heavily like we use the relationship. All play therapy models use the relationship. In child-centered play therapy, that relationship is one of the core foundations of the play therapy process. And think about congruence. Can I be congruent? Can I show up congruent with unconditional positive regard and empathy, just enjoying the presence of my client? Can I do that if certain things are happening that on my inside, I'm like, that doesn't work for me. Um, so identifying some of those things that you can and cannot tolerate is important. And what Bill Nordling said in that training was you have to identify your own personal limits. Like, what are the things that are going to happen that will make you go out of that congruence, out of holding unconditional positive regard and empathy for my client. And if I start finding myself dreading the specific clients coming, then I haven't set enough personal limits. That was so freeing for me. So then I figured out what those were and why those were. And that kind of made all the difference for me to be able to, when things happen, how do I get back into congruence for unconditional positive regard and empathy? So identifying what that is, like what can I not tolerate? Why can't I tolerate it? We're therapists. We're always looking at the inner meaning and reason behind things. So we want to make sure we're not getting too rigid, because that's going to not allow that free and protected space for clients to make that progress. And at the same time, if there are certain things we're like, yeah, that'll send me into, shutdown mode internally, and I'll begin to dread that client. That's not therapeutic. So figuring out your expectations, what your limits are, is really, really important as well. So be clear about your boundaries, reinforce your expectations, especially around parental involvement. That's one of the things that I find comes up over and over, is not sure how to do that work with parents, which is one of the reasons I created I'm in the process of creating the course that'll be coming out probably sometime in early May, or maybe a little sooner, but definitely by early May. So that is it for today. Let me just do a recap. If you want to provide play therapy successfully and reduce your feelings of frustration and worry, then it's really important to identify what are your expectations and why you have them, and communicate those. And it's also important to figure out when your imposter syndrome has kicked in, because that will shut down your ability to communicate and maintain those expectations. It'll derail the effectiveness of your play therapy treatment that you're providing. Here's the thing, we all struggle with imposter syndrome, especially in the beginning. We all go through periods of feeling insecure, especially in the beginning. So if you recognize that you are struggling with imposter syndrome a lot, you may want to look at some of my previous, I think last week or the week before, I talked a lot more about imposter syndrome in previous episodes. You may want to go look at those or listen to those. So, and the other thing is, you need to make sure you communicate what those expectations are to clients at the very, very beginning. When you're clear about your expectations and you communicate those, I would say at the very first phone call, it gives parents or caregivers the ability to think, is this going to work for me? And they may decide that the expectations you have are not going to work with them, and they may go somewhere else. And that's okay, because that therapeutic relationship is important, and you want to set that up for success at the very beginning. So communicating that will help to reduce a lot of the frustration. Does that mean you won't have frustration or hit some bumps along the way? No, but at least you will have communicated what your expectations are. And so when you find yourself in a situation where you need to enforce those expectations, then they've already heard them. It won't be a surprise. The other thing is parents are going to communicate their expectations to you, how, what they need, what they want. So having that conversation at the very, very beginning helps you decide, well, is this a good fit or not? And if so, then this gives us a starting point as we're working together along the way. So that is it for today. So if you're interested in working with me, for Play Therapy Academy is my online play therapy consultation program. We meet twice a month, do consultation in a group, and there are also some courses in there, some other bonuses and things like that. Currently, it's full. I will have one or two openings coming up. So if you're interested, you can schedule. If you're interested in learning more about Play Therapy Academy, then you can schedule a free 30-minute video with me to see if it's a good fit for you. We talk about expectations and how the process works, and um, and then go from there. The other thing is, if you're interested in some of my online courses, I do have the case conceptualization course, which really helps you hone in on knowing what questions to ask and why. Why is it important to take that time at the very beginning? And yes, you do begin developing therapeutic rapport through the questions that you're asking. I always kind of think, how are you going to really understand what's going on with your client and how to help them if you haven't taken that time at the very beginning to ask all the questions and then formulate your case conceptualization to get a sense of what's going on? The other thing is the treatment planning. If you are trying to figure out the best way to help your client, which is treatment planning, then how can you do that if you first haven't done a good solid case conceptualization? So that's a course that's available, Getting Grounded in Play Therapy Case Conceptualization, which also, in my mind, goes right along with Getting Grounded in Play Therapy Treatment Planning. Like, now that you know what's happening and why it's happening, what are you going to do? Even if you have a play therapy specific model that you're using, how are you going to be implementing that for your specific clients? Which then results in, what's your treatment plan going to look like? Like, how do you write a play therapy treatment plan? So in the Getting Grounded in Play Therapy Treatment Planning course, I take you through the treatment planning process based on your case conceptualization. A lot of it, the course is about the practical development of a treatment plan and how do you develop one that's going to have goals and objectives and interventions to address the problems your clients are experiencing. And then how do you put that in a format that aligns with your play therapy model? So we use a lot of case studies in both the courses. We use a lot of examples. I I walk you through 4 different play therapy models to see how that would look with different play therapy models. There's guides and activities that you can use over and over. So if you're interested in those courses, or I also have a course on progress notes. How do you write progress notes that are going to align with your play therapy model and make sense and meet most agency requirements and insurance requirements? So a bunch of courses that I have available, also Getting Grounded in Play Therapy Foundations. If you're interested in any of those courses, then pop over to my website at rhplaytherapytraining.com/courses. And I will see you next week. Bye for now.